In the Aheadyx project case study, you will not only learn how to structure a project like a strategy consultant, but also how to build complex financial models like they are used in restructuring or investment banking. So this case study is really unique because it provides you with a truly ambidextrous working style that teaches you all things structuring and modeling in just one case. So let's get started with the project case study. In this first video, we will introduce the case. That is, I will show to you the situation of the client. Old Fashioned, that is a fashion retailer that's really going down the drain, and we will have a look into that, especially the complications, so why it actually is the case that a situation requires action. There will be some questions that result out of the complication, and then we will have the approach, which is like the answer to those questions. So you may recognize the situation complication resolution framework here, in which the resolution part, can be split into questions and answers, or the approach in this case. So you can make it explicit if you want to, and here I do that to better convey what this case is about. Next, we will look into the working styles. That is, I will present to you how strategy consulting and restructuring really differ in terms of 5 dimensions that we will look into. This is important because the goal of this case study is really to teach you an ambidextrous working style. So you should be familiar with both the, let's say, PowerPoint-driven strategy consulting working style and the Excel-driven financial modeling working style. And last but not least, staffing, which is also very important because to keep your team motivated and the client satisfied at the same time, you really need to make sure that everyone's working on something that's both challenging and doable at the same time. In video 2, we will then set up the project. That is, we will request information early on for the different work packages. We will have a kickoff workshop agenda with the client. We will look into legal entities that are in scope. This is more important in restructuring projects. So in strategy consulting projects, you usually do not need to look into this, but here it matters. And finally, we will put together the infamous PowerPoint strawman, one of the most important things that you will learn in strategy consulting, and where project work is really happening, where all the information is being aggregated. This is your kind of day 0 structure of the project, and you will work on this and into this and add stuff to this all the time. So it's really important to be familiar with this. This project case study is centered around Old Fashioned, a fashion retailer from Germany that operates some 40 branches across the country and makes annual sales of about 30 million euros. The value chain goes like this: they source the fashion from suppliers from Asia, then they sell it through their stores, and there's also their kind of B2B2C branch in which they sell to wholesale businesses, and these then again sell to B2C customers. Now, while Old Fashioned is entirely fictitious, it's important to point out that for this case, I looked up the annual reports of a fashion retailer from Germany that actually recently had to file for bankruptcy, and I closely mirrored what's in these in terms of the business model, in terms of the financials. I adjusted this here and there to make the case a bit more insightful for you, but overall this is a pretty realistic case. So why do we need to take action? Old Fashioned repeatedly breached the covenant, that is specifically the debt-to-equity ratio, with one of their financing banks. It's supposed to be at least 2-1 or 33% in equity, so it should, for example, not be 3-1 or something like that, but below 2-1. And at the moment it's something like 12%, so that's really an issue, and it's not just like that since yesterday, it's been like that for a while. This is not the only problem though. So Old Fashioned's EBITDA margin only was 1-4% between 2021 and 2023, and thus significantly below industry average, which is something like 10-15%. So as a result, the bank asked Old Fashioned to bring in a consultancy to answer 3 questions. Is there a gap in short-term liquidity? Is there a gap in midterm financing? And in case there are any such gaps, should they be fixed? And especially from the bank's perspective, should they, for example, allow additional fresh money to go in or not? Now here's what we're gonna do about this, the approach. Before we deep dive into this, let me make a couple of remarks though. And the first one is this case study has been designed for educational purposes. And because of this, you will find some work packages around here, like for example, building an integrated financial model on the left-hand side that you wouldn't find in a real project. In a real project, you would of course reuse an existing template of a financial model. That's one thing. The other thing is, to answer those questions that we just had a look at, we would not necessarily have to do the entire project. So in fact, it could be the case that after answering question 1, is there a gap in short-term liquidity, which is what we will do in phase 1's first work package, we could find out that this business doesn't have a future anyway, and they can't pay their payables and kind of this way. So we would not necessarily pass this go-no-go gate here. And thus, it could be a case that a case study would just be over there. However, of course, this will not happen here. So for educational purposes, this case study has been designed to be fully fledged, let's say. And as you can see on the lower right-hand corner, gap in financing quantified, that's the result of phase 3. So that's actually answering question 2 from the previous slide. And getting back to question 3, should a bank help this business go into the future? Well, that's kind of also answered in the whole thing, because we need to take into consideration the market perspective, for example, which you find in work package 3 in phase 1, but also all the measures which are around in phase 2 especially, but also in phase 3 where we will quantify these. So we will really go through the whole thing to make an informed decision on the company's future, which we have on the lower right-hand corner. That's really the overall goal that we have here in mind. And with that said, now let's go through each of the phases and see what we get in there. Now here we got 3 phases, and the first phase is about analyzing the status quo and modeling the business, so that at the end of this phase we will have as a result the models prepared and populated. That is, we will have a model on short-term liquidity from work package 1, the integrated financial model for planning the midterm from work package 2, and the market model from work package 3. In phase 2 we will then come up with measures to turn around old-fashioned business. And for that, we will follow a workshop logic, which is why we have the shift to the SS all over the place there as working style. So typically in strategy consulting, you do 3 workshops. You first do a problem identification workshop. Then second, you do a solution space development workshop to see what's possible. And third, you have a solution selection workshop in which you prioritize and choose what you're actually going to do. And here at the very end, we have this 4th workshop even on persona-based steering, which I included for educational purposes so that I can show you how to do design thinking workshops. In practice, you would not necessarily need this. May also be something where the client would say, do we really need this? Because here this is really crunchy, and in a real restructuring situation would only include work packages that you really need. Then third, we have the planning cases and preparing the reporting phase. So here as a result, we have the gap in financing quantified to answer question 2 from the previous slide, and also to answer the third question finally for the bank, so that they can make an informed decision on the company's future, whether they want to support it or not. And to get there, we will do several things, but to keep it short, we will primarily quantify the measures, set up a monthly reporting so that we can track against the development, and that's the main idea here. In terms of the timeline, you can see up there that actually phase 1 is the longest, and then the phases are getting shorter, which is like the way it's in reality too. So typically in phase 1, by the way, let's then start with the first work package. You start with planning short-term liquidity, and that's something that you typically do within 2 weeks. And then usually it goes like this. The client will first always tell you, well, we get this integrated model in place, and it's all integrated and all that, and then you go there and find that they actually do not integrate their plan properly. So usually they plan their income statement, but they do not integrate it with the balance sheet. And then you can sell another 3 weeks for doing that integrated financial modeling and planning their midterm. But here I assume that they really tell us from the very beginning that they do not have it. So this allows us to conduct phase 1 within 3 to 4 weeks. Next, we have modeling the market. And that's really something that I want to highlight here, because it's typically not included like that by restructuring consultants. It's more coming from the commercial due diligence side, let's say, by strategy consultants, but it makes a lot of sense to include that. And the reason for that is If you look at the integrated financial model, you will find that there's really one line item that drives the entire thing, and that's the top line, that's sales. And the reason for that is kind of everything else is really dependent on that. For example, material expenses are usually planned as a percentage of sales. And then there's working capital, which you plan based on DSO, DPO, DIO. We will get to that in the case, but the thing here is these KPIs, they depend on sales or material expenses usually. And if material expenses depend on sales, then that means that the entire working capital is basically driven by sales. And as sales, material expenses, and working capital are the most important items in your integrated financial model. Sales and material expenses, I think that's obvious because these are like the key sales and expense items, besides maybe personal expenses and other operating expenses, let's say. And working capital, well, that's important in restructuring because it drives liquidity. You can improve liquidity based on optimizing working capital. That's the reason why sales is so important, because it drives the entire thing. At the same time, I should point out that in terms of the measures in restructuring, you usually focus on cost cutting rather than sales improvements. And the reason for that is cost cutting is something you can control more or less. You can just do it if you want to do it. Whereas increasing sales is something, well, you need someone to buy your stuff, right? Or someone to be into your new product line. So it's not that controllable. And that's why restructuring typically is more centered around cost cutting, because it's more controllable. Phase 2, I already covered quite in detail, I think. Let's just add here that for validating those hypotheses that we get out of the root cause analysis, so hypothesizing root causes as the first work package, we will do some more in-depth analyses, segmenting customers and analyzing competitive positioning and benchmarking store sales intensity. Now here, again, you could argue that in a real restructuring project, you would not necessarily spend your time on this. You would have more pressing things to do to improve liquidity rather than to improve your sales. And well, benchmarking store sales intensity may still be fine because you could potentially cut costs here. But still, let's say in a real restructuring project, you would rather focus on other levels compared to these. But as it's really interesting, and I think something you might be interested in learning if you're more into strategy consulting, I included this. Now, this should be doable within 2 to 3 weeks. And then finally, for phase 3, we only have 1 to 2 weeks left, but that should do, because really only what we need to do is plan the base plan first. That is baseline the client's plan. Usually there are some measures already around there when you get a plan from them, and we need to remove them first to really start from zero here. And we should also challenge any assumptions that they incorporated. For example, a lot of clients will tell you something like, yeah, we planned with sales going up by 5 to 10% in the next couple of years. And then you ask why, and then they tell you, yeah, well, yeah, that's just kind of what we expect of how our business will go. And obviously you can't go with this. Planning the base and management case, that's about quantifying the measures that we came up with in phase 2. The difference here is that the base case usually contains the cost-cutting measures and liquidity measures, so things that you can readily do, whereas the management case is more daring and more about sales improvement measures, so things that are not necessarily that much under your control. And finally, as the third work package, we will prepare the monthly reporting, set up a presentation and a model for that, so that we can track if the measures are really working, and this then will conclude the project. So in this video, we cover the situation, the complication, the reason why the situation requires action, that is, the questions that really characterize this complication, and finally the approach, so what should we do about this now? Next time, join me for an in-depth discussion of working styles, so we will have a look into strategy consulting and compare it with restructuring based on 5 dimensions. If you're about to make a choice which side to choose for your career, make sure to check that out, and I'll see you in the next video.